So let's talk about next a little bit more on emotional eating and what drives that. Because we know that there are kind of 7 different appetite triggers. Okay, and so there's 7 kind of physiological hungers, and those are taste, smell, sight. We know those are 3. Then remembered things, so you might have you remember some things in the cupboard, or you might remember an experience and think about something, so there's a mental trigger, and we know that there's an emotional trigger. And then we know that there's 2 true hungers, so that are cellular hunger, so that's when your blood sugar drops down or your nutrient levels drop, and that's when you might get cravings, or you feel a little bit lightheaded and you know that it's time to eat, or a hunger in your stomach, like your tummy's rumbling or it feels empty. So there's those kind of physical hungers that are kind of personal hungers, but you're going to be triggered into them. And then there's the environmental, which is the situational, conditional, and social. And so those are kind of like your environmental triggers. You're going to have personal triggers and environmental triggers, and they usually overlap. Okay, so we know that there's these different appetite triggers, of course. And then with emotional eating, there are specifically 5 things that will trigger or kind of stimulate us to eat. And usually what happens is that we are eating in an attempt to soothe, distract, stimulate ourselves. So like you're probably already aware that you eat. If I say to people, what are the reasons for eating, they'll shout boredom, they'll shout because it tastes good. Like, it's very rare that the first reason that anyone shouts out in my workshops is hungry or to nourish our bodies. Like, the reasons for eating, the first things that people will shout out will be because it tastes good, or because I was bored, or because emotional eating, because I was stressed. So there's usually all these reasons: unmet needs, stress, sometimes shame, fear, and values conflict. So usually when people start to eat for emotional reasons that are non-hunger reasons, so they're not eating to nourish their body, and they're looking for hedonistic pleasures, they're looking for a way to make themselves feel better that is external for themselves. And a lot of people turn to food. Some people turn to exercise, some people turn to reading, some people turn to shopping, some people turn to gambling, but what's happening behind the scenes is this drive that we're trying to soothe, stimulate, distract, or comfort ourselves. And at some level, and people are turning to food, and so we can clearly see that. Do you think eating is going to take away a fear rationally? Unless the fear is fear of starvation, eating is unlikely. Emotional eating, too much cake or ice cream in a response to a fear, is unlikely to solve the problem. Having a values conflict, so someone asks you to do something that doesn't feel good and you do it, and then you go home and you feel really bad, and so you eat to kind of soothe or distract yourself. Can you see how that's not really solving the problem? Or shame, a lot of people start to feel ashamed, or and that stimulates a cycle of, like, I remember speaking to a client and she said, look, I eat because I feel bad, and I feel bad because I eat. So this shame cycle, she was just trapped in the cycle where she just felt bad about herself and she felt so guilty, but she couldn't snap out of it and she didn't know how to get around it. So the shame was driving her to do the very behavior that made her feel bad about herself. So we need to go there with a lot of compassion and say, you know, I accept myself who I am and all the different parts of myself, and now I'm going to learn how to live with myself, love myself, and manage myself, because that's all it comes down to, is but first with a lot of compassion and acceptance for who you are and what you do, and just like a lot of compassion for, wow, that's who I am. And I understand that there were things that led to me becoming like this, that might have triggered me, or it might have been a coping mechanism, and just go there with a lot of compassion. Because if you go there with this energy of I'm awful and beating yourself up and this negative self-talk and this shame and this, you know, you kind of shrink yourself and you cripple yourself. So we really need to go there with a lot of respect, compassion, empathy, and love for ourselves. And when we come from that position and we say, well, I wonder what the things are that might have been triggering me or driving my emotional eating, and what happens when I feel out of control. Because when we can do that, we can think about what are the antidotes to all of these things. How do I get my needs met? How do I meet myself at point of needs? What are my needs? What are the needs that usually drive me to eat inappropriately, or that trigger me to eat too much or the wrong types of food? And can I identify a behavior chain? Can I identify certain triggers that lead to that? And what else can I do? How can I get that met? And is there a need that I can identify as consistently not being met, and I'm trying to fill a void? Because a need is a need. It needs to be met. Okay, it's not like a want or a whimsical desire. It's something that actually it needs to be met, or you're going to be trying to compensate or kind of get around that in some way. So it's identifying, okay, so maybe it's a need for connection. You know, sometimes loneliness drives people to eat, or sometimes, you know, a feeling of, you know, not fitting in, or rejection, or social isolation. People will be eating to comfort or soothe themselves. Stress is a huge one. We're going to unpack these two in particular in a lot more detail. But you know, I just did want to highlight shame and just be thinking about how can you meet yourself at a point of just compassion and acceptance. It is really important that, and through all your journey, if you can be going, when you do make changes, if you can keep your focus on what are the changes that I have been making, and just applaud yourself, excuse me, and then if there's places that you're getting stuck, rather than going there with a whole lot of, oh, I'm not good enough, I'm failing, go there with, okay, let's just revisit this strategy. What else do I need to learn? How can I go there with compassion and like just this perspective of, I want to be in a position of self-leadership. How can you motivate yourself? And you know, things, you know, we know that, you know, how can you trigger yourself? How can you increase your ability? And how can you motivate yourself? And looking at things like that. Fears, non-negotiables, boundaries, assertiveness. We will go into that in a little bit more detail. And values, it's really important for you to be knowing what you stand for, what your convictions are, and what your non-negotiables are, so that you don't bump into these value conflicts. Because sometimes it's going to be necessary for you to say, no, I'm sorry, I can't do that, or moving yourself out of a community or a position, or something that, or having a conversation, even if it feels like a difficult conversation, about something that is a values conflict, so that you can resolve that.